Welcome everybody to our part 4 of our CTR series. And those of you who know me, my name is Shelley Frappier, and most of you know me as Nico's mom, Nico's mama. And I'm also the executive assistant at the Cute Syndrome Foundation and Hillary's right hand. I'm stepping in for Casey today as she's in the hospital with Stella. And as most of you have seen in our support group, many of our families are hospitalized right now. Our children are hospitalized, and I'm sending you all hugs and well wishes. And if there's anything that Hillary and I can do to support you or help you, please just send us a message and we'll do whatever we can to get you what you need. Today is the 4th of a 6-part CTR series, and today we have the opportunity to speak with a consulting company that helps companies navigate the various stages of the process to get a potential treatment onto our pharmacy shelves. We do have a couple of housekeeping items. You can interact with the group chat on your right here. I definitely am having problems with my chat. So I have 2 windows open. Sometimes that helps. Or if you exit, come back in to see the chat. But please, if you have any questions for Hillary or Adam and his partner, please feel free to enter them in the chat. If you're having any tech issues, Megan is here today to help. And we'll monitor both the chat and the support group to see if anybody needs help. But before we get started, I wanted to thank our Platinum CTR Series sponsors, Neurocrine and Praxis, and for their contributed support for our foundation. And I'd like to welcome Hillary, the director and founder of the Cute Syndrome Foundation. She's live from Boston, where she is attending the Child Neurology Society meeting. And while she's traveling, she's always advocating for our families with SCN 8A. So Hillary, thanks for doing that and jumping on in the middle of your trip. And Adam, welcome as well. I'm going to hop off, but if you need me, I'm here.
Thanks, Shelley.
You're welcome.
And yeah, before we get rolling, just a few other comments. As Shelley said, I'm coming here from coming to you from Boston, and taking lots and lots of meetings with our pharma partners, and trying to learn, about how best we can navigate these next stages, and how we can help them, and how they can help us as well. And I think it's a neat moment to be having the CTR series happening in the midst of those conversations. And just as a reminder, and Adam, to give you kind of some background, we started this series last year as a way to get our community ready for a clinical trial. And, we started with really basic things. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, so sorry I'm late.
No worries. We're having fun here. So I was just doing a little bit of an intro. I was explaining to Adam that we sort of started this series a year ago, kind of doing basic education for our community about, what are inclusion and exclusion criteria? What is a clinical trial anyway? Why do we have placebos? How can we be involved? And this year, as we're looking at literally very soon enrolling our first patient in our first clinical trial for the SCN8A community, we are trying to have more specific conversations as a community about, what the clinical trial is in nitty-gritty details, but then also how we can remain engaged as a community, even if our children aren't participating in a trial. So I also, before we get rolling, I want to give a plug for a program that we have going on. Some of the things we're going to be talking about today are areas where our storytelling capacity as a community is really important. And we do have that upcoming Moth storytelling project in October. So folks, if you haven't signed up and you want to sign up, we still have some slots available. Now, to get to the meat of the discussion, we're joined today by Adam and Sharon from SC Associates to discuss, as we mentioned, some of the ways that our community can help with the drug development process, beyond supporting a clinical trial directly, all the way through approval, ideally, and commercialization. So thank you both for joining today. And I know we had a great conversation a few weeks back, and I'm so excited to sort of share some of that with our community. So I'm wondering if maybe we can go one at a time and you can just do some introductions to start with. Let us know, kind of before we look at slides and dig into things, who you are, what you do, and why. That'd be great. Adam, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you, Hillary, for inviting us. And thank you all for just, I think, the work that you're doing. You know, each of you, I imagine, are here for your own personal reason, but you're also the act of gathering in an organization, institution like this is just an encouraging act of generosity and humanity that just, as a human myself, just looking out at a dark world with a lot of hard things, encourages me that there are people who are working hard together in the midst of difficult things and just saying, hey, this is what it looks like to be together. So it's an encouragement to be with you today. So my name is Adam. I'm an associate principal at ZS in our San Diego office. ZS, briefly, is a global management consulting firm that works primarily with the life science industry. We do have other industries, but our kind of work in the life sciences is across from the very beginnings of R&D and drug development all the way through commercialization, and then kind of bringing therapeutics, diagnostics, devices to patients. So that's kind of our role as a company. My role in particular, so I lead our West Coast practice that works with what we call emerging pharma. So these would be companies that are either they haven't launched a drug or therapy yet, so they're kind of in that preparation stage to enter the world and say, hey, we're here, we're available, or they're in their first launch. We call that pre-commercial or early commercial. And so that's kind of my role, is to work with the management of those companies to help them think through how do we get ready and make sure that we understand the needs of our customers. Customers, as we all know, they include people like us. We're individual people, and we have family members that need to receive care. But of course, in our modern healthcare system, the customer also includes the physician and their staff and the insurance companies and the sites of care where the care is delivered. And so that's kind of our role, is to help, my role to help smaller companies navigate this very intimidating journey for them so they can be ready to engage with folks like you. I think maybe I'll say one other biographical point that Hillary, I think, highlighted. She said, tell us why you do this. So I used to be a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., working for big technology and agricultural chemical companies. And I think one of the things that really drew me to ZS is the mission of using the power that large organizations have for good. I'm not trying to say I'm paying back the sins. I don't think I ever can for the things I've done in my past career, but just trying to add a little bit more value and brightness to the world in my current role. So glad to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate your kind words about this community. It is, as I think I mentioned to you, a really extraordinary community, and we are really good at coming together, and it's something we're very proud of. So Sharon, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Sharon Sutcliffe. I lead work on the patient and consumer health team at ZS, and I'm based in the New York office. Before I get into the background for myself, I do want to just again echo the words of Adam and say thank you so much for doing what you do. I'm a mother of two, and I know how excruciating it can be when something's going on with your child, and how hard it is. And so I thank you for getting up every morning and doing the great work that you do, and doing it also for others, because it takes so very much. And you inspire me. And if there's one message I could leave you guys with, or just plant as we start our conversation today, is that please keep doing what you're doing. It's so important and has an impact. You have a voice, your voice matters, and we hear you. So that might lead me into the type of work that I do. So I lead a service line at ZS around what we call patient centricity. And what that is essentially helping pharmaceutical companies take in and integrate the things that are important to you, to patients, to caregivers, into everything they do, into business decisions, into drug development, into things like pricing, into development of support, into marketing, all of it. And doing that in a meaningful way. And meaningful meaning meaningful to you. And also it has to have an impact on the pharma business. We have a strong belief that, and we've seen evidence that when you put people at the heart of the business, everybody thrives, right? People get the services, the treatments they need. Pharma gets to save money and make more money. Ecosystem is happy because we potentially avoid, what we call ER disasters. And so there's a lot of emphasis on this type of work in pharma today. I don't know if many of you know that. I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to do this type of work. And then I was hoping what we do today is maybe pull back the curtain a little bit, and I can talk to you about what pharma is doing behind the scenes to try and integrate your perspective, your voice, your needs. And please, I'd like this to be a conversation. So I could talk all day. So please do chime in with questions either in the chat or through the moderators. And I'd be happy to focus on things that are of interest to you. So how did I come to do this work? I actually started my career outside of healthcare and outside of pharma. For about 10 years, I did marketing communications in luxury lifestyle and fashion. So W Hotels, Mercedes, Burberry, think about, really high-end brands. And a lot of that work focused on experience, giving people a really great experience so that they choose these brands. And after 10 years of selling liquor and nail polish and shoes, I decided that I really had enough, and I wasn't interested anymore. And I was trying to figure out a way to use the skills that I'd honed in giving people a good experience for something a little bit more meaningful. And to be honest, I fell into healthcare and pharma by accident. I got a call from a recruiter who said, hey, look, I want you to come talk to these people who are looking for someone who can help with pharmaceutical communications to people, to patients. And I think based on what you're telling me, you might be interested in this. And so I went in and I met with people and I was like, oh, wow, okay. If I can give people a good experience while shopping for a car, I better be able to do a better job of giving people an experience of interacting with treatments with their health. And as I started to do that work, it occurred to me that we do a terrible job of communicating with people around treatments, of helping people understand what kind of choices they need to make, what the risks and benefits are, and that there's not that much focus on experience. And so I went back to school, got an executive master's in public health, and this was around the time that the Affordable Care Act was really starting to take hold. And so I had the opportunity to study under the people who architected that bill and were leading big changes in the ecosystem around this concept of patient-centered care, of putting people at the heart of how we care for people. And I thought, well, this is really interesting and really important. And by the way, pharma needs to do something about that. And so long story longer, that led me to the work that I do today in helping pharmaceutical companies put the patient first. So that's a little bit about me. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So what I thought, and Hillary, please do chime in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. And I find this is just so fascinating. And I love the way that you've set this up to let's just pull back this curtain a little bit. And you guys are so well positioned to do that for us. And I think our families have a lot of questions about what is behind that curtain. So I'm really eager to jump in. Our families are, I think you probably missed in the beginning, we do have a lot of kids in the hospital right now. So our families are maybe a little bit on the lower engagement side today. Usually they're hard to keep them from stopping questions, and I'm sure that they will get rolling as you talk, because I see we have some people here who will have great questions. But I think we can get rolling on what you've prepared, and then the families are always pretty good about asking as we go, so they'll interrupt you.
And excellent. And then if folks have missed this and they have questions later, please do share my contact. I'm always happy to chat.
Fantastic.
All right, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen.
Yeah. Do you see the little screen with a line through it?
Yes, I do.
That's the one.
Thank you. I'm not usually this terrible at this.
We were talking before you got here about our firm belief that when things go a little sideways in these kinds of settings, it just makes us all feel a little more human together. I think that's really ideal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you guys see a full screen? Do you see two screens or one screen?
One full screen.
Perfect. That's exactly what we need to see. All right. So let me jump in. So there's going to be a bunch of jargon as I talk through. So again, please do ask questions. What we do at ZS is we've done this study. This is our second time doing this study to try and benchmark, meaning get a sense of how the pharmaceutical industry is doing in as it relates to a true focus on the patient. Now, when we break it down, we use these 4 dimensions, that's what we call them. Essentially, think about them as categories to try and parse out what pharma is doing and whether they're doing a good job or they've got some room to grow. The way that we do this is we interview folks from different pharmaceutical companies. We tend to interview 40 to 50 different people to try and get a sense, and then we rank based on an assessment. We have a scorecard. So the types of questions that we ask, I'll give you a sense of what goes into each one of these. So under leadership and culture, we ask questions like, does the organization have a written down, clear mission around a focus on the patient? If I ask 10 different people at the company what that means, could they tell me what that means in their specific role? Are they putting patient needs at the heart of how they decide what drugs, what products they're going to bring to market? Are they funding teams or different initiatives to help truly bring in the patient perspective? When we look at structures and practices, it's things like, how are decisions made and where is the patient's perspective in all of that? Do we close the loop? Do we come back to people and tell them, hey, based on the input you provided, here's a decision we made? Are there key performance indicators? So these are the metrics that pharma might use to figure out whether they're doing a good job or have more work to do. And also it's a way to figure out whether there's some accountability for a focus on the patient. In data analytics and tech, here we look at what are the systems and mechanisms through which companies can gain an understanding of people. And that's both through primary research. So I think a lot of you participate in this, meaning filling out surveys for pharma, having conversations with folks like myself or Adam, participating in focus groups, or it could be secondary, what we call secondary data, which is things like analysis of insurance claims to try and understand what is how people might go through the system and the types of physicians that they might visit, or doing social listening, which is we mine the social web to try and understand what is the sentiment around certain experiences. Is it good? Is it bad? Can we get some hypotheses about where we might have some opportunity? And we think a lot about how is that information democratized, right? Because it's one thing to get the information, but you have to do something with it. And so if it just sits in a PowerPoint, it's not that useful. And the last one is cross-industry collaboration. So how is pharma working with others? So working with advocacy groups and patient groups, caregiver groups such as yours, working with others in pharmaceutical companies, working with health tech, working with healthcare ecosystems like hospitals, provider organizations, insurers, and of course, working with regulators, right? How are we collaborating with regulators to help to make sure that patient-reported outcomes are considered and are important? How are we helping to move the needle? So this is the framework that we use to do this assessment. To date, we've looked at over 24 different pharmaceutical companies. They tend to be probably a lot larger than the ones that you guys are intersecting with. And I say that because I think some of the things that you'll see here might surprise you. My experience has been working with small companies and very large companies is that both have work to do. The difference with the smaller companies is they tend to be more nimble and can move a little bit faster in terms of making changes. All right. I haven't seen any questions so far. Can you guys, everybody still good? I'm going to go with yes because I can't quite see the screen.
Yes, I think we're good.
All right, excellent. I'm going to continue then. All right, so then this is from our 2021 benchmarking. What you see here is the scale at the top. This is what we use to assess pharmaceuticals maturity in terms of patient centricity. The majority of companies, as you can expect, are somewhere in basic to foundational. So meaning they're starting to build out some of these structures and practices. They're starting to move beyond just experiments and pilots and really instituting certain behaviors. No one is advanced across the board. There's no one who's there, and certainly no one is transformational. So we have a lot of work to do. The good news is that we've advanced, right? So the industry as a whole has advanced from 2018 to 2021. It's not that much time, but it's enough time to make an impact. And the ways in which we see pharmaceutical companies really making changes are around a couple of things. One is organizational structure. And I think this is important because hopefully it's a signal to you as to the importance of your work and your voice. We're seeing now more than ever that there are very senior folks in pharma organizations. So think SVPs, C-suite, head of a certain function that have responsibility for what the organization might call patient centricity, right? So that means that accountability is going all the way to the top, which is great. The second is we're seeing resourcing, right? So we're seeing more investment. So there's an investment across different functions. So meaning folks in clinical development who might be in clinical operations might have a specific function that's focusing on patient experience. Or that might mean that someone who is running the patient support program might have a specific responsibility around what they call insights, which is making sure that we're hearing from you as to what's important, what the needs are, and whether or not we're fulfilling it. And then the last point, which I find interesting, and it's probably more true for larger organizations than smaller organizations, is that we see that the established activities are mostly on the commercial side of the organization. So that means after a product has already been approved by the FDA. Now, we are seeing a lot more happening in clinical development, but it's slower. And it tends to be slower because there's this fear of being out of compliance, and because the regulations and the guidances from the FDA and EMA regulatory agencies is still evolving. And I've got one more slide I'm going to show, two more, sorry, that I'm going to show you guys.
Yeah. Sharon, just to interrupt, I think we did get an interesting question in from Shelley that I think maybe you and I can both take a turn answering if you want. Thank you, Shelley, for the question.
Excellent. Adam, why don't you go first while I read the question?
Yes. Yeah. So Shelley, I'll just read out for folks that maybe are listening and aren't able to see the chat. So Shelley is saying, we here at the Acute Syndrome Foundation love sharing information. We're always trying to gather important information about our families that we feel is relevant to help get a drug on shelves faster to help our children. We've just completed a feeding and medication formulation survey and share the results with one of our industry partners. Are these insights appropriate, and how can we make sure that they are done timely? So this is incredible. And I want to tell two brief stories, which essentially are going to say, yes, Shelley, these are very appropriate, and here's some ideas on how to do it timely. So I worked with another pharmaceutical company. Actually, it's in the rare epilepsy space. They had their product on the market in the United States for maybe 3 years, and of course, 10 years of development before that. And this was the first ever indicated treatment for this rare form of epilepsy. But to be honest, the formulation was really rough. It was a pain to store and administer, and it created stress. And no one needs to tell you that life is already stressful enough. And so the good news is this company realized, hey, we've got a major problem here, that we could actually change our formulation. Now, if you are a global pharmaceutical company, it's kind of a pain to change your formulation because you've got to do new clinical studies to demonstrate the safety, efficacy, shelf stability of that new formulation. So that's a difficult thing. It requires an investment of time and money. In this company, there was a really engaged patient advocacy organization that was helping that company see, hey, this is an opportunity here to help not just help your patients that are using the product currently, but there may be people who, when a physician suggests this, say, you know what, I just can't handle that. The formulation, I know it might work better than the alternative from an efficacy, but just my life can't handle just the complication of using this. So there was a number of patient advocacy organizations that really helped bring the voice back. And then what happened is that created a big debate, a healthy debate inside this company where they said, wow, is it that expensive to run new formulation trials? No, it's not that expensive. In fact, there's essentially no risk because if they don't work, if the new formulations aren't good, well, we've at least tried. So, our firm kind of partnered with them to say, hey, how can we help capture the voice of everyone in the decision process, right? The caregiver, the patient, the physician, the pharmacist, and really work through. And I'm encouraged to say, they said, all right, let's go ahead with this. But I share that example because sometimes it might feel like, oh, it's too late. They've already made this decision. They screwed up. They didn't hear us. Well, it's not too late. With sufficient advocacy and attention, I think companies I've seen change and correct a mistake. The counter example, it would be a company that's 3 or 4 years from launch. So they're in the middle of their phase 2 trials and they're trying to decide which formulations do I take through phase 2. And for them, they said, well, we actually want to know what formulations are good. And oh man, that one sounds like it's really appealing to caregivers, but that might be technically more challenging. The conversations inside this company between the people who care about the voice of the customer, the people who are the scientists doing the development, those were some of the first times those people talked to each other. And it was really enabled because there was this, voice of folks that said, hey, we are the actual people going to be using this. Here's what we want to say. So I think just 2 stories to say, either whether it's 3 years from launch or 3 years post-launch, hearing from you and in every means possible, right? Hillary just being the convener of this organization, but even you just being part of on patient panels where there's emails coming out to say, hey, will you take this survey? That can fundamentally change the direction of a global pharmaceutical company.
Absolutely. And I echo that. And there's dozens of stories that I could share with you about getting your perspective in early and how it has changed the way that a pharmaceutical company has gone about their clinical development, prioritizing the products, and how they brought those to market. And there are many stories where pharmaceutical companies, there is like 3 or 4 that come to mind for me immediately, where pharmaceutical companies didn't spend the time to talk to the community, to hear from the community early on, and develop products that essentially were not useful. In one condition, it was especially thinking about formulation, there was a transition in this condition from a once-a-week injectable to a daily pill. And the company thought this would be amazing and great and everybody would want it. And guess what? The community did not want to change because they knew how to do the injection. They felt confident in terms of the results. They knew what to expect. And with the pill, there was not the emphasis on hearing from people as to what they wanted to know. So from a pharmaceutical company, it makes a lot of sense to talk to people, to patients and caregivers early and get that perspective. And I think right now, pharma is learning, or many have learned the hard way, that when they don't, it hurts their business. And so there's a lot of incentive for pharmaceutical companies to do that. So please do continue to fill out the surveys. Are the patient centricity indices published for companies? How can you look at a company and see how oh, what a great question, Madeline. So the question is, are these indices published for companies, and how can you look to see how patient-centered company is? So in the industry, there's a survey called Patient Voice that's published, and you can get access to it. And that one is a survey that's done with patient advocacy groups across different conditions, and they rank the perspective of patient advocacy groups on different pharmaceutical companies. That's the only one that I know that will tell you publicly about which company, about the different companies. The surveys and the work that ZS does and other companies like McKinsey, Deloitte, BCG, et cetera, the types of studies that we do tend to be anonymized. So, and the reason being is that we're talking to our clients and we're doing these assessments, and, I'm going to throw out some examples, but, UCB or Pfizer may not be so interested in having some of these things in the public domain, right? For their business.
So you mentioned that the scale of the companies that were involved in developing this report tended to be larger than the types of companies that we're dealing with. And I always joke, there's one company that we deal with now that's actually, they've grown significantly, but when I first started talking to them, they were literally 4 people. And so, it's as small as they get, basically. And so I'm wondering about whether you see trends. Certainly it's harder to track something like that in the same way that you might with a UCB or a Pfizer, but do you see anecdotal trends that associate the size of the company in the early stages And the patient centricity, do you think it's like, are we trending towards these smaller companies being more patient centric out of the gate, or no?
It depends. So I get that question often. And here's generally what we see is that when companies are first starting out, especially if they're working in rare disease and conditions where there haven't been treatment options in the past, there's a lot of engagement with patients and a lot of input in terms of the patient voice. As these companies grow and scale, they have to make a deliberate effort to be patient-centric, right? Because it's not the 4 founders anymore, right? It's maybe a company of 5,000 or 500 or even 200. And that's when they have to do the work. I'm actually working with a company right now in rare disease that is going through that transition. They started out small, they started in rare disease, they were bringing treatments for conditions that have never had any options before, right? And now they've created options. The challenge that they're facing is that they've lost their core, right? There are less than 1,000 people in this company, but they've lost the focus on the patient. The focus has shifted to making sure that they meet the requirements from their investors. And so the work that they're doing now is very deliberately bringing that culture back, bringing the focus back, mandating and creating what we call SOPs, but different ways of working and structures that not only enable people to talk to patients and caregivers, but also require it. So you can't go to the next step until you've done this and done it meaningfully.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Hillary, I think what I've seen is some smaller companies have the aspiration that their focus on the patient will be their competitive advantage against larger companies. And so people like Sharon are able to work with every size company, and she advocates, to find that mission no matter the size. When I think about, the Cute Syndrome Foundation in your community, I mean, imagine there's a lot of executives in these small companies that job hop, right? If you just take a 5-year period, the person who's the VP of drug development or the chief commercial officer, these people are going to keep changing. And so maybe they're in a company right now that is struggling or is torn, right? Or has lost its way, as Sharon said. But I think being engaged with companies like that, and even if it's just a personal relationship, a friendship, hey, they're a neighbor, they're someone I met at a conference, and saying, look, like, this is what we're doing as a gathering of caregivers, of patients. To me, I think there's an opportunity to say, hey, that next time that executive gathers together a team to start a company, because a lot of them won't stay to scale, they'll go on to the next thing, can over time, I think that could be like, hey, that's their angle. That's how they say, we're going to be both competitive and make a difference in the world, bringing that patient centricity. There's a pediatric oncology company that's setting up shop in the Bay Area. They're a few years from launch, but that's their animating principle, is to say pediatric oncology indications are neglected because they're not as lucrative as adult oncology indications. So we're going to be the platform to launch for pediatrics. And so that's their whole DNA. And so I think that's like, okay, well, maybe an executive leaves there and comes to another organization. How do you kind of help be that inspiration to them? I think is an interesting idea.
And just to build on that, Adam, and just go back to the points from Shelley and Karen in the chat, 2 things. One is, we often see that when there's leadership changes within an organization, new leaders come in, they want to put their stamp on the organization. They usually change a bit of the strategy and the structure. And so to Adam's point, there's kind of 2 things. One of the work part of the work that we do, that I do, that Adam does, is that when we're working with a company is make sure that we're putting in structures and practices and different key performance indicators, metrics that will stay. Right? That when that executive leaves, this is already entrenched within the company. It's really hard to make that change, as opposed to having it be something that, will shift and change when that CMO or CEO takes on a new position. That's one. The other thing that I will say, and I'm just, Karen, I'm reflecting on the point in the chat that you have. We're so lucky to have pharmaceutical companies that are willing to listen and interact with our families. To me, it's unfortunate that it's a willing, right? I think it's a must do. It's a must do. And that's what we're pushing the industry to get to not a place of, oh, it's a nice to have a conversation and talk and listen to families. But when it comes out, well, why wouldn't I do it? I'd be, putting myself in jeopardy if I didn't do it. And so that's the big move that we're seeing now in the industry.
Yeah, and it's something that I've been fortunate to kind of watch unfold in a couple of different scenarios. And I think our families, to a certain extent, have seen the levels of the different kinds of interfacing that can happen. And, there's obviously also, I think, some confusion. And, as somebody who walked into this world without having any industry experience, I was confused early on that different companies at different stages can interact with you differently, and that there are regulations in place that are intended to protect patient communities. Whether they actually do under all circumstances is another question. And then on top of that, so there's the regulatory environment, and then on top of that, there's the internal culture of how legal and regulatory interpret those requirements and how much risk they're willing to take and how risk averse they can be. And I think you said something really important there, Sharon, which is, if you start to weigh, I can't afford not to do this as part of a risk benefit equation, that changes the discussions. But I think it might be helpful if you guys could talk through the families a little bit about, a fully private company, early stages, a public company, and then a company that has a commercial product, and how that sort of the interactions shift with a patient community over time under those circumstances.
Yeah. Adam, do you want to take that one, or you want me to start?
Yeah, I can give what I've observed. So often when a pharmaceutical company is first gathering, the people who are helping to create it are the scientific, medical minded people. So they have discovered a molecule or have found something that they think someone else has overlooked. And so the early stages, often there isn't a deep understanding of, we'll call it patient experience, because there's a big focus on, hey, this is a mechanism of action that's totally new, or wow, like we've been hoping to extend the effect of this, from 3 weeks to 8 weeks. And so there's a lot of, think of the computer whiz is excited to tell you like why the computer is cool and better. And it's like, there's a lot of that. That's the kind of people in the company. As they start to make bigger investment decisions, okay, how do I progress this from the lab into, preclinical trials with, animal models, and then into the first human trials? Now there'll be typically a few people that join the company that are like, okay, yeah, how is this going to become a business one day? And so when the person who's there to say, yes, this is great that it's research, but how is it actually going to become a business? Now someone's thinking about, well, how does this product actually get used? Is it a patient in a private practice with a physician having a conversation and together they decide to take it? Or are you in a moment of crisis and you're in the ER and it's actually the patient has nothing to say about it because it's the medical team in that moment of crisis? So there's a bit of, okay, what we'll call that, like, what is the stakeholder journey or the way that this product will get, who's going to decide to use it and how? That's kind of the first point in a small company's existence, where there's probably attending to not just what is the product, what will it do medically, clinically, but how will it get used? Who will choose to use it and why? And as they progress really into phase 2 and 3 of the drug development process, now we're starting to get closer to, okay, we actually think this will work. A big reason small companies stay small is that people are really expensive, and you don't want to hire people full time until you know that the drug's actually going to work. And so that's where there's a lot of this kind of, well, we'll wait and see until we get our phase 2 results. If those are good, now we'll hire a few more people We'll invest more in listening to our end customer base, whether that's the patient, caregiver, physician, pharmacist, et cetera. And so as they're kind of into phase 2 to phase 3, now they're like, okay, we have a decent chance of making it. Once you get close to phase 3 or your early results of your phase 2 trial are looking really good, you might start to build out an entire team. So now you may actually hire a brand leader who's going to be, their whole mindset is who will use this and how, and what do we say? How do we explain it? And that will be a person who's really eager to hear, from patient caregiver communities. Now I'm describing this kind of from the standpoint of a single product company where that journey is taking place. That same journey can take place in a large organization, because there'll be a team of people that are just clinical at first, and then they'll do clinical and early business. And then as that gets de-risked, then kind of launch people or marketing people will kind of come along. So that I don't think it's such a big company, small company difference, except maybe your relationships with someone that leads marketing at a big company. That person may pivot inside that company to join a preclinical or pre-commercial team. So that maybe would be the main difference there in terms of what are they looking for. And it really comes down to risk and investment in the types of leaders that would be listening to people like you. I think that's where, I'm not sure I'm answering Hillary's question, so I'll pause there.
You are. It's a complicated question. There's a lot of layers.
I'll build on that with the types of people that caregivers, parents, patients, people, and patient advocacy group leaders like Hillary will interact with at different stages might vary. So from a pharma perspective, so for small companies, they might call Hillary up themselves, right? As we've seen. And those relationships are directly with the people who are working and developing the products. As companies become more established, it looks a little bit differently. So you may not get a call from the chief medical officer. You might get a call from a group called Patient Affairs, right? And they're responsible for working with patient advocacy groups and getting that perspective. And you might get a call from what we call vendors like Syscript or Snow. I don't know if you guys have heard of these, but these are companies that pharmaceutical companies will contract with to help them find people with XYZ conditions that are willing to talk to them about it. And so when you get these random calls, please do pick up the phone or return the email, because that's a way that larger pharmaceutical companies, I'd say probably even smaller ones. I worked with a small biopharma earlier this year to do a mobile ethnography to understand the experience of parents of kids with a certain rare condition. And we went through this third party to go and find people who are willing to participate in this. And so as companies grow, become larger and more mature, it's more likely that they'll go through these third parties to connect with people. Now, one thing that's really interesting, that's a trend in the last 2 years, is that pharmaceutical companies have noticed that they don't do the best job of getting diverse and representative perspectives. That sometimes when we do that type of research, we end up getting input from middle-aged white guys with good insurance. And that's not necessarily representative of the population, right? And so they're working to set up these internal committees, right? It could be small. I have some clients who've stood up these committees of maybe 5 to 6 patients and caregivers. And those are serving as advisors to the company and almost like a gut check, right? So they're reviewing materials, they're reviewing how they're going approaching market research or talking to patients, and they're helping to do a gut check. Are we really being patient-centric? Are we remembering to put people at the heart of business decisions? Are we doing a good job of getting everybody's perspective? Another way that I've seen this happen is companies are now putting together these larger panels, right? And they may be, and they include maybe 200 to 300 people, and they may not include, and they include people who have the conditions that this pharmaceutical company is working in, and also conditions that they don't work in, because they're trying to get more broad learnings. And so, and these types of panels work in a similar way, right? It's a way for pharmaceutical companies to hear from you as to what's needed, what's not needed, what's been a good experience, a bad experience, what do you need more of, less of. And I think a lot of it also helps to demystify some of those regulations and interpretations of regulations that Hillary mentioned. I think in clinical development, we're seeing now that more and more companies are getting more comfortable with bringing in the patients because they understand the downstream impact and ultimately the business impact. And I think the more that we can bring in people into the conversation, the easier it's going to be for pharmaceutical companies and biopharma companies to figure out how to do that more efficiently and do it faster.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about this as a scale problem. I mean, for larger indications, and then of course as a ultra rare community where we're looking at 500 diagnosed patients approximately worldwide, with shockingly now 2 potential treatments coming toward clinical trials, which I don't think our community always fully understands how extraordinary that is, because it's just been our experience and we've been very fortunate. But how that process is even more important when you're looking at a trial design where you literally need almost every single patient that can meet the criteria to be in the trial. Understanding the specificity of our lived experiences. And I think I just want to applaud our community at being so good and at being responsive about what their experiences are, and how when we go back to pharma and I have this list of, hey, this is how we deliver medications through a feeding tube. These are the steps that we take, and they're all diverse, right? Because everyone's sort of doing something different. And the looks that you get when you're like, no, wait a minute, we got to think about this is in a tube in a lab with good lighting. This is 11 p.m. with your sleeping child, and you've unzipped the safety on the side of their bed, and you're trying not to wake them up, because if you wake them up, they're more likely to have a seizure, which nobody wants at baseline. But also, if they're in a trial with seizure count, you certainly don't want that to be happening, because you're interfering with them. And what does that look like, and what does that feel like? And I think those are experiences that are so important and visceral, and in a small community, if you aren't capturing those, you're potentially creating problems internally in the trial. And I think this is something that I really like our community to hear it echoed back in the things that you're saying, that, when we tell our stories, when we talk about our experiences, and not just like, yeah, I had a kid and this is, day 1, day 2, day 3, but those actual, again, that feeling of pushing a syringe through a feeding tube, a syringe of medication, what that means, and how then that tracks in the minds of the people who are making decisions about how to move forward.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'll share a recent experience working with a mid-sized company where they were preparing to launch a product in a rare disease. And they did a lot of, they spoke to patient advocacy groups, they did a lot of research, they spoke to patients, and they learned that there's a big need in terms of tracking symptoms, right? And so they said, great, we can help with that. We can do that. So they decided, okay, we're going to create an app to help with this, because everybody's got their mobile phones in their hands. And then they made the smart decision of saying, you know what, as we develop this, we should probably do it with the people who gave us this feedback to begin with. And so over a weekend, we set out to do an interactive experience, co-creating, working together to figure out, what is this app? What should it be like? What features does it need, et cetera. And one of the exercises that we did, and Hillary, your comment made me think of this, was having somebody take us through, literally step by step, what a good day looks like and feels like, and what a bad day looks like and feels like. And it was very powerful going through that. It took several hours. And what we discovered was that these individuals don't need an app for tracking at all. They've been doing it their whole lives. They know how to track their symptoms. They've got their own ways and they're fine. But what they really needed was some sort of alert system, so that when they're in crisis or need to go to the hospital, they can let their group, their people know. And so that's the path the pharma company went. But, I think to emphasize Hillary's point, the stories, the details, it matters so much. And I know sometimes it's hard, but please do keep sharing that. We hear you.
I love that example, Sharon, because I know we've talked a lot about how can you influence the pharmaceutical company. It's like, well, is this product packaged and formulated the right way? That's been a kind of a big example, but I love what Sharon's example is like, well, is it also symptom tracking or is it actually alerts? I wanted to share another example of the kind of thing pharma can do in response to feedback from communities like yours. And so I know in rare disease, one of the biggest challenges is getting the right diagnosis, right? How many doctors you have to go through and printing out your records and no, it's not this test, so we have to do this test again. And just that whole complexity of, finding the right diagnosis, the right care team. And so I think there are things that, pharma is like, yes, they make the drug, that's their job, but they also partner with healthcare systems and other entities, electronic medical record companies, where there are these creative partnerships between pharma as the company creating the drug, and then the entire rest of the community and ecosystem, right? Healthcare system, the EMR. And I think one of the growing areas that I've seen is, hey, how do we reduce the time to accurate diagnosis? And so that's going to require a partnership between pharma, who's doing all of the science on this disease and what the markers are and what to do, probably health systems where neurologists and specialists are working, and then people like Epic that make electronic medical record systems and connecting those dots. And so I think that, I know that you've lived through that frustrating experience getting to diagnosis, but that's like an example of sharing that frustration, say, hey, this was really hard getting here. I had to, as a part-time, full-time job, advocating, connecting the communication dots, and you're not an expert, right? You're a regular person whose job isn't to be a medical expert. Well, how can the healthcare system, the EMR company, and pharma, come together into those partnerships? So I think that's a growing area that I've seen, and I think it will continue to grow if that, that description of that experience is shared, because that becomes an opportunity to say, wow, not only are we missing patients because they're not getting correctly diagnosed, but only those with the capacity and time and energy to fight those battles get through to the end. And so, there's a win-win there, right? Pharma wants to find the patients and get them the product, and you want to get to the right diagnosis and treatment plan sooner. So that I just want to give that as another example beyond drug formulation.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, it's a really good point, because we've been sort of talking about how we position ourselves to help. I think everybody here knows I sometimes can be a little bit blunt, but, I always like to say to the people I work with in pharma, my job is to help you not screw this up. And so we've been talking about that, but what we haven't talked about is the places where that process gives back to us. And what you're talking about, Sharon, is, and Adam, is, maybe not necessarily directly to us personally, but maybe other people on the journey. And I think that's, I know I want to be mindful of our time, but I think that's something that's really important, that as a community, we need to be thinking about how we benefit from this process beyond just having a drug at the end of the line.
And just to echo that, I think there's been a recognition that pharma's done a terrible job of giving back. And so there's a movement now to give back things like your data. If you participate in a clinical trial, don't you want to know what happened? So you should have access to that, and in plain English, and in language that you can understand, that anybody can understand, right? That you don't have to be a scientist or a PhD to understand. And I know we only have 2 minutes left, but I did want to address the question that Shelley put in the chat. One was a comment around trust, meaning you're right. In this day and age where we get a lot of spam and phishing emails, it's hard to know who to pick up the phone or return email to. So I think that's very fair. I think many companies are recognizing the importance of working with patient advocacy groups. And so I think that's happening more and more. Oftentimes, the vendors that I spoke about will work through patient advocacy groups. However, I'll tell you, I think this is more true for outside of rare disease. But outside of rare disease, the folks tend to be engaged with patient advocacy groups, tend to be very engaged in their own care. And sometimes you need the opinion of the person who's not really engaged in their care, the person who's not gonna, search online or be active in social media, because they matter too. And so I think that those are the instances where we might go through some of these companies. And to address your question around how can we get the Cute Syndrome Foundation on the radar of companies, keep doing what you're doing, telling your stories. I think this work that you're about to do with the Moth is incredible, because there's nothing more powerful than stories, right? That's how we learn, and that's how we interact with the world, right? That's how we socialize. And so please do keep telling your stories, and we will find you.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the real strengths in this community, is our storytelling, and how, I'm a firm believer in a good story can move mountains, because it helps people remember where they need to focus and what's important. And when we talk about, and I think in our community, it's so easy to normalize the fact that we are monitoring our children for their breathing and their heart rate overnight, that we're staying up, late so that we can meet med alarms, so that we can dose medications 3 times a day, that we're trekking hours away to get our children the adequate care that they need. And getting into that interstitial, like, this is what life is so important to tell the people who need to be moving mountains for us or with us. And I think on that note, I know we're at time, and I want to wrap us up and thank Adam and Sharon for taking so much time out to speak with us, and your kind words about our community. They're very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm super happy to answer any other questions if folks want to reach out.
Yeah, we will share the video from today with our families who need to watch asynchronously, and if there's other questions, we certainly will pass them along. And super appreciative, and I'm sure we'll have the chance to touch base again soon. So thank you both for being here, and I just want to, of course, thank our sponsors again, Neurocrine and Praxis, for sponsoring this really wonderful series. We're so grateful. Always thank you to my team, Casey, Megan, Shelley, for keeping this program up and running. And then just a reminder, we're back here again next week. And actually, interestingly, thinking about some of the things that we talked about today as far as collecting our records and those the meaning that's in those records. We have Praxis coming on to give us some really high level feedback from our citizen initiative. So we have enrolled just under 100 patients in the Citizen platform. And as all of you remember, we did our first 50 in a morning, which is pretty amazing. And we're starting to see that data come back. And Praxis is going to be on next week to talk to us about how that information is helping them design their trial, and more broadly, just telling us more about our community. So I'm super excited for next week, and I hope to see all of you back here again then. Adam and Sharon, you're welcome to join us as well. So with that, I'll let everybody go, and thank you again, and see you next week.